You know, there's times when I just like to come into this place, come into our church's sanctuary, and just experience the quiet, look around at the stained glass windows, look at the high ceilings, listen to the echo that's in this place. Because you know what happens in this sanctuary, the experience we have of the presence of God and the presence of the community of faith is so important. And I know that for many of us, through this time of pandemic, that whole experience of what happens in sanctuary has changed radically for some. I mean, some have still gotten to the place where they're not coming into this place to worship. And you know what? That's okay. For me, I love being in this place because of the way it draws me into God's presence. And that got me to thinking about how even in my childhood, there was this experience of being drawn into God's presence when I would come into worship. And some of it happened in strange ways. In fact, one of my most distant memory, my first memory of experiencing worship was when I was a kid. We were living in Albuquerque at the time. And it must have been one of the first times that I was participating in worship. I was in the children's choir. And in our church, we had pews up on the chancel area, and us kids were sitting in the pews, and we sang our song, and then we stayed in the pew for the rest of the worship service, which I think the pastor, after this experience, decided that that was a mistake. Because you see, what happened was while I was sitting up there in worship, I had my legs crossed like this, but I had it dangling over the edge of the pew. And that's when I discovered this experience of what happens when your foot falls asleep, and it starts to tingle. And I noticed that when I banged my foot against the pew, it felt really cool. And so I was doing that all the way through the sermon that the pastor was preaching. He kept looking around at me, and I could tell he was like giving me this look, but I didn't know what was going on. I just felt he was looking at me because he was preaching, and my parents were out there waving at me and everything, and I would wave back. I had no idea that I was being disruptive in worship. But it was, as I reflect back on that, it was my first experience of feeling, this is home for me. This is comfort. Being in worship was comfort for me. Even as a kid, I didn't always understand what was going on. I certainly didn't understand what that pastor was talking about all the time. But I understood something in this experience about worship that was so formational for me. Well, a couple weeks ago, I was reading from a book written by seminary professor Walter Brueggemann. And he was talking about how worship has lots of different elements in it, but one of the things that happens in worship is this constructive experience of our constructing our image of God in worship. And I thought, that's a really interesting idea. He wasn't saying that we are constructing God. He was talking about how worship allows us to construct our image of God. That what happens in worship, through the liturgy, through the music, through the sharing of the word, through the reading of scripture, the experience of being in worship, and I think this could be at home or in the sanctuary, the experience of being in worship was an experience that constructed your image of God. And so he went on to talk about how that within that construction of the image of God, the way we are worshiping then matters. And he talked about how, and this is great oversimplification, he talked about how in worship, in that experience of worship in traditional settings, the liturgy and the music often presents us with a God who is very distinctly other than us because of the language that's used in the music and in the liturgy is this almost distant God. But it's a distant God that we reach out to try to understand. It's a mysterious God that is so different from us, and yet a God who is still within our reach in the experience of worship. Then he says that in a contemporary worship service, the images and the language that's used in contemporary worship is much more God is friend, God is companion on the journey, God is buddy. And he says that language that happens in worship gives us this image of Jesus as friend, Jesus as someone who is a close companion. And what's interesting is he says, when you think about it, you need both in worship. You need to have both. And I think that's one interesting thing that's happening in our blended worship now that we're doing here at First Presbyterian Church, is we're trying to blend that experience. And it helps draw us close to God in different ways. And it's helping, perhaps, for some of us, construct this understanding of who God is. But here's the thing. If you are going to construct an image of who God is, you got to ask yourself, what are those images that I have? In other words, for some of us, God is like this cosmic CEO who's in charge and control of everything. For others of us, God is this great being in the sky who's got this check mark that is checking off all the things that we're doing good and bad, and is like this angry one who throws down lightning bolts at us to punish us. You know, for others, this image of God is like this grand magician who is there to grant us wishes or to do these magical tricks for us. You know, for others, God is like this clockmaker who gets things ticking and then steps back. And that image that we have of God is an image that we construct. But the hope and the prayer is that as we're constructing an image of God, we construct an image that has one key element in it. And I think that this one key element can be in both contemporary and traditional worship. That one key element is this. John's letter, known as 1 John, chapter 4, I think communicates this image really well. He says, "Beloved, let us love one another, because love is from God, and everyone who is born of God knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, for God is love." You know, this idea of God being love, this image of the God who loves us, who may be distant from us and yet desires this relationship with us. And so in the midst of traditional worship, we're reaching out to that God. That is one of the ways that we can communicate this God is love idea. This idea in contemporary worship where God is buddy, God is companion, God is friend can be one of those ways that we can feel that compassion for love. But the key is we need both. We need both, and we need to have this full understanding, this full perspective of who God is, because God is bigger than any one image that we can offer up. Yes, God is friend, but God is more than that. Yes, God is other, but God is more than that. And how we experience God in worship helps build that perspective. So here's my prayer for all of us, is that somehow we find a way to worship. If you come into this sanctuary or you come into another sanctuary, that you find a way to enter into worship and ask yourself, what is the liturgy? What are the songs? What is the message? What am I learning? How am I constructing this image of God? And you know what? If we're sitting at home or watching worship and experiencing worship on our TV screens, we can have that same experience. Where is God, and what is God telling me today about who God is and who we are? The key is finding a way to worship in such a way that you and I can be drawn into God's presence. So that's my hope and prayer, is that you find that avenue to understand the image of God that's being given to you.